Before the crowds roared in colossal amphitheaters, before the names of gladiators echoed through Roman taverns as living legends and emperors were hailed with raised spears and blood-soaked reverence, there was only the ritual silence of death. The gladiator, before becoming a spectacle, was a sacrifice. Long before the Colosseum, when Rome was still learning to become Rome, the earliest battles between armed men took place not for entertainment, but as offerings to the dead. In the ancestral Etruscan culture, whose legacy the Romans inherited more than they dared admit, it was believed that the soul of a deceased noble needed blood to find peace. And that blood did not come from animals, but from living men, forced to duel over open tombs, while the living mourned around the stage death. Thus was born the seed of a ritual that would one day bloom into carnage. In the early centuries of the Roman Republic, records show that noble families organized munera, private funeral combats, to honor deceased relatives. In 264 BC, the sons of Junius Brutus held what is considered the first recorded Roman gladiatorial game, in tribute to their father, with 3 pairs of fighters clashing in the shadow of their ancestors. It was still intimate, somber, ceremonial, but Rome was growing, and with it, its thirst for power, conquest, and blood. As it conquered peoples, Rome also absorbed their practices. From the Etruscans came the ritual, from the Samnites and Campanians, the combat. Prisoners of war, brought back from expansionist campaigns, were now used not only as enslaved labor, but also as entertainment. The arena ceased to be a sacred passage and became a stage. The sacred gave way to the public, and the people, hungry for distraction, craved to see pain, but pain performed with honor, courage, and skill. Death now had an audience. Political power quickly understood the value of this directed violence. A well-staged gladiatorial game could turn an unknown politician into a people's hero. The games became currency for prestige and campaigns, a means to soothe social tensions and drown out the city's real conflicts beneath the cries of the crowd. The plebeians forgot their hunger and inequality for a few hours, as long as they saw steel against flesh, sweat against blood. Cicero, in his letters, noted the people's passion for such spectacles, and Livy recorded how, even in the 2nd century BC, the Fra Munera began to become public and frequent, organized by magistrates, consuls, and senators. Over time, the number of combats increased. The events grew in scale and structure. Grandstands were built, fences raised, participant lists engraved in marble. What was born as mourning became celebration. The gladiator, once a symbol of pain and death, came to bear the weight of heroism, even if chained, even if forced. The arena became a cruel synthesis of Rome itself, empire built on suffering, glory forged through sacrifice, spectacle elevated above humanity. But it would be a mistake to see it all as savagery. For the Roman people, there was beauty in choreographed death. There was honor in dying with sword in hand, staring into the eyes of the one who held your fate. The gladiator was both slave and warrior, cursed and idolized, victim and symbol. This ambiguity fueled the popular imagination. The city walls were adorned with frescoes of famous duels, and graffiti celebrated the champions of the arenas with names and nicknames as if they were stars in a theater where the final applause was the silence of death. And Rome, insatiable, wanted more. Each fight crueler, each weapon more exotic, each warrior more refined. The machinery of spectacle was taking form, yet behind the roar of the arena, the spirit of the earliest rites still echoed like an ancient whisper. For even as the crowd applauded, even as the thumb chose between life and death, Rome never forgot. The gladiators came from mourning, and at the heart of the arena, between dust and blood, death remained the greatest spectacle of all. Rising like a stone giant in the heart of Rome, the Colosseum was not merely a construction, it was a declaration of power, of dominance, of architectural perfection in service of violence, of a people who transformed bloodshed into public art and execution into a legitimized spectacle. When Emperor Vespasian ordered its construction around 70 AD, he was not merely envisioning a new amphitheater, he was designing a monument to control hearts, manipulate crowds, and eternalize his dynasty. The site chosen for the Colossus was symbolic. The private gardens of Nero, once home to the artificial lake of the Domus Aurea, would now be returned to the people as a collective space for entertainment. The tyrant's realm would be replaced by the glory of the masses. The Rome of spectacle was burying the Rome of ego. Originally called the Amphitheatrum Flavium, in honor of the Flavian dynasty, the structure soon gained the nickname Colosseum, due to its proximity to a colossal statue of Nero standing over 30 meters tall. But it was not the name that impressed, it was the grandeur. With a capacity for more than 50,000 spectators, distributed across social tiers that mirrored with mathematical precision the hierarchical structure of Rome, the Colosseum was a physical reproduction of the empire itself. At the base sat senators, consuls, magistrates and priests. Slightly above, the equestrians. Then, the common citizens. At the top, the poorest and even the women, who, though segregated, were captivated by the combat. The engineering of the Colosseum was so advanced that its underground mechanisms, known as hypnotic, became legend. A labyrinth of tunnels, cages, hidden compartments, and moving platforms allowed wild animals to appear suddenly in the center of the arena, as if spit out from the bowels of the earth. Manual elevators, operated by ropes, pulleys, and slave labor, transported bears, lions, gladiators, and entire stage sets to the theater of death. In some events, the arena floor was covered with golden sand, flowers, red pigments, and even perfume, a sadistic contrast to the crimson blood that would soon stain it. Each fight, each hunt, each execution was a brutal opera, rehearsed with precision, yet always open to the chaos of real life. In the early years after its inauguration by Titus, son of Vespasian, the Colosseum hosted 100 consecutive days of games, a spectacle so monumental it entered history. It is estimated that thousands of animals and gladiators perished during that time, a sea of blood to quench the thirst of an entire city for control and distraction. Every detail was meticulously planned, from retractable awnings, velaria, to protect spectators from the blazing sun, to the drainage channels beneath the arena that facilitated the removal of bodies. The Colosseum was literally a machine of death, but also of performance, psychological domination, and social order maintained by the fascination of controlled horror. And there were rules. Even in the midst of apparent chaos, the combats were directed by arbitri, judges who regulated the duels, stopped unfair matches, and declared winners. It was not blind chaos, it was choreographed chaos. The gladiators were trained, their fights followed specific styles, and the audience, educated in the language of the arena, knew how to distinguish between a fair duel and a disgraceful slaughter. Rome had trained its eyes for spectacle, and the Colosseum was the temple where that liturgy was performed to perfection. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Colosseum lay not in its stones or weapons, but in what it symbolized. It was the eye of Rome. An eye that watched, that judged, that showed citizens and enemies alike that power was everywhere, even when disguised as entertainment. The emperors, seated in their imperial box, did not merely observe, they decided. With a single gesture, they could grant life or decree death. The arena thus became the magnified reflection of Roman politics, where everything could be decided by the roar of the crowd or the silence of a hand. And it was on this stage, made of stone, sand, and blood, that gladiators became legends. There, where beasts roared, where swords gleamed under the Italian sun, where life lasted only seconds and glory was paid in scars, the Roman people found what they called justice, beauty, faith, and catharsis. The Colosseum was not just the place of combat, it was the combat. Rome's eternal struggle to keep its people captive, not with chains, but with screams, not with promises, but with blood. Not everyone chose the arena. For most, the fate of a gladiator was imposed with the same brutality that shaped the borders of the Roman Empire, through conquest, through punishment, through condemnation. And yet, there were those who, by their own will, passed through the gates of the training schools, surrendering their bodies to steel and the crowd. In ancient Rome, becoming a gladiator was at once a sentence and a chance, a living contradiction, etched into the scars of men who, amid iron and discipline, sought not only to survive, but at times to be seen. The origin of a gladiator said much about the empire that forged him. The vast majority came from peoples defeated in military campaigns, prisoners of war, Gauls, Thracians, Numidians, Dacians, captured, humiliated, and sent to the Ludium, the gladiator schools, where the transformation began. The enemy's body became a spectacle. The foreigner's resistance was reshaped into technique and performance, and the defeated culture was appropriated, stylized, and sold to the public as exotic. A Thracian with his small shield and curved blade was not just a fighter. He was a domesticated image of conquered savagery, offered to the audience as a living trophy. But they were not only prisoners, there were also the condemned, common criminals, murderers, thieves, rebels. These were the Noxi, usually sent to the most savage battles, often unarmed, thrown to wild beasts or experienced gladiators simply to die in public. Their bodies were not valued for skill, but for pain. Their deaths served a purpose: to cleanse the city of its filth, to reinforce the terror of the law, and to feed the arena with disposable flesh. And yet, there were those who entered willingly. The Beati, Octorati, free men who, driven by necessity, desperation, or a thirst for glory, enrolled to fight as gladiators, selling their freedom in exchange for payment, training, and a slim chance, however faint, at fame. In times of economic crisis or social dishonor, becoming a gladiator was a dark but possible path. The contract was formal. The man signed in blood and agreed to live under the authority of the lanista, the owner of the school, as if he were a slave. His possessions belonged to the empire, his life to the crowd. But his name, if he survived, could become eternal. These volunteers were not well regarded by the Roman elite. Many senators and free citizens considered it disgraceful for a man of status to stoop to the level of the arena's slaves. But the people saw it differently. An Octoratus who fought well, who bled with honor, who faced death more than once, could become a popular hero. He earned nicknames, portraits on walls, the size of women. Some had their images molded into lamps, jars, murals. Others even inspired songs. The arena for these men was a stage upon which to reinvent themselves. But the road to that stage was brutal. Upon arrival at the ludus, the future gladiator was stripped, examined, classified. His body was assessed like livestock: height, muscle mass, endurance, old scars. He was given a specific diet, rich in barley, legumes, and water, to gain bulk and strength. He trained with wooden weapons heavier than the real ones, to build muscle and reflex. He endured punishment, slept in narrow cells, and was watched constantly. Fear was constant, but so was the possibility of rebirth. Some called it hell, others a chance. In those damp stone corridors, amid screams, blows, and whispered prayers, the beasts of Rome were born. Men who, having lost everything, could win the world with a single victory. And even if they didn't, at least they would leave their names engraved in the dust of the arena, even if only with their own blood. The choice to become a gladiator, when it existed, was never simple. It was a desperate gamble against insignificance, a way of screaming at the empire, "I am still alive." And as long as Rome applauded, that scream would not die. Behind thick stone walls in buildings closed off like fortresses lay the true crucibles where the Roman spectacle was forged, the Ludi Gladiatori. The gladiator schools were more than training centers. They were disguised prisons, laboratories of pain, where men were shaped through repetition, discipline, and fear. Upon crossing their gates, the gladiator lost his freedom, his name, his civil identity, and gained a new skin, marked by sweat, scars, and the constant expectation of dying before thousands of hungry eyes. There, the creature of the arena was born, not by choice but by method. The most famous of these centers was the Ludus Magnusi, located beside the Colosseum itself, connected to it by an underground corridor. But many others were spread across Rome and the provinces of the empire. Each was commanded by a lanista, the owner of the school, a businessman, an exploiter, and often a former gladiator who understood better than anyone the logic of spectacle and suffering. The lanista bought, trained, and rented out his gladiators and held absolute power over them. In the eyes of Roman law, these men were nothing more than property, living parts in a machine of blood and gold. Daily life in the Ludi was relentless. The day began early before sunrise with heavy, repetitive, punishing exercises: running, weightlifting, jumping, simulated combat. The instructors, known as doctores, taught specific techniques for each type of gladiator, based on armor, weapons, and fighting style. A retiarius learned to cast his net and strike with his trident with near theatrical precision. A murmillo, armed with gladius and shield, was trained to endure exhaustion until the final blow. There was no room for creativity. Perfection came through repetition, and mistakes cost broken bones, or life itself. The training weapons were made of wood, but heavier than the real ones. The logic was simple. If a man could fight well with a heavy weapon, he would be faster and more precise with the real one. Sparring among peers was constant and closely supervised. There was no mercy, only control. Blood was common, but death was avoided. A dead gladiator before the arena was a financial loss to the lanista. The atmosphere was tense, suffocating, filled with latent dread. Fear hung like a heavy mist. Any sign of defiance was punished with whippings, isolation, starvation, or torture. The lanista kept his men in line through constant surveillance. There were informants among the gladiators themselves, and any hint of rebellion was crushed with brutality. Yet revolts did happen. The most famous of them, led by Spartacus in the 1st century BC, began within a ludus in Capua under Crassus, proof that even the most thoroughly trained captive could shake the pillars of empire. But not everything was pain. For some, the ludus was also a second chance. Men who had lost everything, homeland, family, dignity, could earn respect there. A gladiator who trained with excellence, who showed bravery and skill, could rise within the internal hierarchy, gain small privileges, and even become an instructor. There were internal bets, rivalries for reputation, silent alliances, and mortal enmities. The school was a microcosm of Rome, brutal, complex, governed by power and appearance. Their diet was carefully planned. Contrary to the myth that gladiators lived off raw meat and blood, archaeological analyses of bones found at gladiator sites revealed a diet rich in barley, legumes, dried fruits, and vegetal ash, ingredients that promoted muscle mass, energy, and bone recovery. They were called barley eaters, and the goal was simple: to build resilient bodies capable of surviving multiple battles and delivering unforgettable shows. At night, the gladiators slept in cramped cells, often shackled. Yet even there, among bars and whispered prayers to forgotten gods, something was born that Rome could never erase: the strength of men who, though deprived of everything, learned to turn pain into courage. The ludus did not set them free, but it taught them to fight for a single second of glory. And sometimes that second was enough to become eternal. In the Rome of spectacles, even death required aesthetics. The arena was not a disordered battlefield. It was a stage. And like every stage, it demanded distinct characters, well-defined roles, unique costumes, and recognizable styles. Thus emerged the Cactus gladiator classes, carefully crafted categories that combined weaponry, combat choreography, visual appearance, and cultural symbolism. The people were not merely watching fights. They were witnessing confrontations between archetypes, between symbols, between narratives distilled into steel and flesh. Each type of gladiator was trained to represent not just a technique, but an idea, a stylized vision of Rome's enemies, of the barbarian, the foreigner, or even the hero. Thus, the arena transformed into a kind of ritualized performance, where it was not enough to win. One had to play the part convincingly. Among the most famous was the murmillo, often portrayed as a powerful warrior, wielding a short gladius and a large rectangular shield, scutum. He wore a heavy helmet with a crest and full face protection, evoking the image of a traditional Roman soldier. He was the fighter of strength, endurance, and patience. His style was defensive, waiting for the perfect moment to counter-attack with precision. He frequently faced off against the most agile of gladiators, the Iritiarius. The Iritiarius was a unique figure in the arena. He fought without a shield and with minimal armor, usually just protection on his left arm and shoulder. He carried a net uitana tridentitazanaim short dagger. Inspired by Mediterranean fishermen, his role was cleverness against brute force. He attacked from a distance, trying to entangle his opponent with the net before striking with the trident. He moved quickly, danced around his enemy, provoked him, and flaunted his lightness. But he was vulnerable. One mistake, and his exposed body became easy prey. Another classic pair featured the Hausecutor, created specifically to fight the Retiarius. His helmet was smooth, with no protrusions or decorations, designed to prevent the net from catching. It had limited visibility, requiring focus and determination. Armed with gladius and shield, He advanced like a silent predator. His name comes from pursuer, and indeed, his mission was to hunt the retiarius until he had him cornered. The tension between speed and strength, lightness and weight, made this duel one of the crowd's favorites. There was also the Thraex, or Thracian, inspired by the warriors of Thrace. He fought with a small shield de pius parmula, a curved sword called a psica, and wore elaborate armor, including a decorated helmet and high greaves. His style was agile and slicing, designed to strike the opponent's vulnerable spots with oblique, unexpected blows. He often faced the hoplomachus gods, whose origin lay in the Greek hoplites. This one used a short spear, round shield, and gladius, fighting with discipline, technique, and defensive posture. Other less common but equally striking classes included the provocator, often used for internal duels within the same school, with a chest plate and simple helmet, and the Dimachorus, a combatant who wielded 2 short swords, one in each hand. The latter offered a visual spectacle of pure agility and elevated risk, since he carried no shield at all. Each of these classes followed not only the logic of combat, but also the logic of spectacle. The pairs were designed to create contrast, light versus heavy, reach versus protection, brute strength versus cunning. And the audience recognized these dynamics. They cheered, shouted, bet. They knew the Murmillo had to endure, that the retiarius had to fly, that the Thraex should strike like a serpent. The arena was a cruel dance, where the roles were rehearsed, but the ending was always unpredictable. The armor, beyond being functional, was theatrical. It gleamed under the Roman sun. Its metals shone. The helmets were carved with figures of griffins, mythological beasts, birds of prey. The blood staining their garments made the contrast even more dramatic. The gladiator, however enslaved, was treated like an actor in a theater of iron and bone. And like any actor, he knew that once he stepped into the arena, the world was watching and expecting a performance worthy of death. The sun had not yet broken over the horizon, and already a rising murmur filled the streets of Rome. It was a day of spectacle, a day when the entire city pulsed to a single rhythm, anticipation. Families walked together, nobles adjusted their finest tunics, vendors set up stalls of bread, dried fruits, and watered-down wine, and crowds squeezed through the streets toward the greatest stage on earth, the Colosseum, the arena where fate was decided by blades and applause. It was a celebration of death, wrapped in popular ecstasy, in public festivity, in a collective ritual of catharsis. For Rome, other people's pain was entertainment, and entertainment was politics. The day of combat followed an almost liturgical structure, marked by rituals, schedules, and expectations. It began with the venations, the animal hunts. In the center of the arena, men known as bestiari faced beasts brought from every corner of the empire. Lions from Africa, tigers from Parthia, crocodiles from the Nile, bears from Germania, wild bulls from Iberia. The scent of blood mixed with straw and the sweat of the crowd, as the roars of beasts crossed with the roars of the people. The animals appeared out of nowhere, lifted by hidden platforms, released through secret gates. The sand-covered floor was soon stained red. Next came the public executions, the most brutal part of the day. Those condemned to death, criminals, traitors, deserters, were brought to the center of the arena to die in front of everyone. Some were executed by simple methods, beheading, crucifixion, stoning. Others met their end through elaborate scenes, mythological reenactments that ended with the victim devoured by animals or burned alive. The audience watched with fascination, absorbing every drop of violence like nourishment. It was pedagogy by fear, justice staged as theater, and no one dared look away. But it was in the afternoon that the heart of the celebration beat strongest. It was time for the gladiator duels. The names of the fighters had already been announced days earlier, plastered on posters around the city. People placed bets. They shouted for their favorites. They knew their fighting styles, their backgrounds, their victories. Like modern athletes, gladiators had legions of fans. Some, more famous, received gifts, love letters, pleas. They were paradoxically adored and disposable. And there they stood side by side, awaiting the sound of the tuba, the instrument that announced the start of the fight. Before entering, the gladiators underwent a ritual of preparation. They received their real weapons, sharpened, polished, lethal. They donned their designated armor, adjusted their helmets, struck their chests. They prayed, some to Mars, god of war, others silently, to any deity that might still listen. Some embraced, others shouted to ignite their own spirit. The corridor leading to the light of the arena was narrow and dark, like a womb, and as they emerged, they were reborn, not as men, but as symbols, as offerings to Rome's thirst. Their entrance into the arena was marked by an iconic phrase, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. Though this salute was not common to all combats, it became an eternal symbol of absolute surrender to death. It was an ambiguous reverence, respect and defiance, submission and provocation, and the crowd responded with roars. The emperor waved, the magistrates observed, the betting closed, and then the fight began. The duels could last mere minutes or stretch into long, tense sessions. Every movement was watched with intensity. The clash of shields, the ring of swords, the cries of pain, the crowd's gasps with each precise strike. When a fighter fell, wounded but not dead, the most symbolic moment of the day approached, the decision of life or death. The gladiator would extend his arm, begging for mercy, and the crowd would decide, with screams, gestures, pleas. But it was the emperor or the editor of the games who made the final gesture. Thumb turned down. Life. Thumb pointed forward. Death. The exact meaning is still debated by historians, but its symbolic power has never faded. If mercy was granted, the gladiator was taken for treatment and might fight again. If death was decreed, the final blow had to be clean, direct, honorable. The victor was applauded, rewarded, sometimes with coins, crowns, even freedom. The fallen's body was removed by servants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of Hades, who dragged the dead with hooks and cleansed the arena as one would cleanse an altar after sacrifice, because that was what it was, a pagan mass. And Rome, devout to war and control, celebrated its faith with blood. As the sun began to set and spectators slowly filed out of the stands, silence returned to the arena. A heavy silence, almost sacred, as if the Colosseum itself exhaled, emptying what it had absorbed. In the blood-stained sand beneath the reddening sky, the last echoes of applause still lingered, and somewhere, deep within the city, the surviving gladiators returned to their cells, more wounded than alive. They knew, tomorrow perhaps they would be the chosen ones, but as long as they breathed, they were sons of the arena, and Rome would keep watching. There was a moment in the arena when time stood still, when the roar of the crowd fell into a sudden, expectant hush, when blood still trickled from the wounded body on the ground, but the heart beat on, faintly, waiting for a gesture. The gesture, that sacred and brutal instant, where everything converged into a single symbol, the thumb of power, for the fallen gladiator, for the victor still standing, and for the crowd that watched. It was the culmination of a ritual as ancient as the empire itself. To live or die, not by merit but by spectacle, not by justice but by decision. The defeated gladiator, upon falling, was expected to acknowledge his loss with dignity. Many dropped their weapons, knelt and raised their left arm with 2 fingers extended, a sign of supplication. It was their final act of agency. The crowd would then begin to shout, some calling for mercy, others demanding death. The stands became an assembly of clashing voices, but the ultimate decision lay with the editor of the games, usually a magistrate or the emperor himself, seated in his tribune, surrounded by senators and guards. His gaze did not simply see the body. It assessed the performance, the impact, and the meaning that death would carry for the glory of Rome. The gesture that immortalized the power to choose life or death became an icon of Western culture, the thumb. In modern popular imagination, we are taught that a thumbs up meant mercy, and a thumbs down meant death. But historical accounts, from Juvenal, Suetonius, and Prudentius, suggest that the original gesture was more nuanced. In Latin, the expression used was pollis verso, with a turned thumb. But turned how? Downward, sideways, up? Many scholars now believe that a raised thumb represented the drawn sword, the signal to kill, while hand a thumb concealed in the fist symbolized sheathing the blade. That is, regardless of the exact direction, what mattered was the gesture's meaning. the will of Rome, embodied in the hand of a single man. And this absolute power, conveyed through a single motion, was what made the spectacle both mesmerizing and merciless. The victorious gladiator waited for the decision without celebration. The fallen one watched, sweating, bleeding, often already resigned to his fate. Once the sentence was given, there was no hesitation. The final blow had to be clean, precise, usually delivered at the base of the skull, to spare pain and demonstrate respect. It was a cold end to a hot life of struggle. Some gladiators, even as they died, kept their eyes open, defying the crowd, dying with honor, for they knew that in the arena, to die well was as important as to fight well. One did not simply die. One died with style, with resolve, with glory. And this unwritten code, this combat ethic, was deeply respected in Rome. Those who died bravely were honored. Their names were inscribed, their feats remembered, and their images painted. Death, though involuntary, became a stage for eternity. Those who were spared returned to the gladiator school, where they received treatment, trained again, and in some cases were celebrated. A gladiator who survived multiple battles could earn freedom, a prize called the rudis, a wooden sword presented in a public ceremony, symbolizing liberation. But few reached that point. Most fell on the sand before then, under the eyes of Rome, as living offerings to the empire's insatiable hunger for control and emotion. And it is a mistake to think the games were mere entertainment. They were pedagogy. The audience learned in watching these theatrical judgments who ruled. They learned to accept that life could be granted or taken with a gesture. They learned to love strength, to fear weakness, to worship dominance. Rome educated its people through blood, and the emperor's thumb was often mightier than the gladius itself. It was that silent gesture, a finger pointing to fate, that defined the soul of the arena. For more than swords, more than beasts, more than shields, it was the simple movement of a thumb that made Rome the grandest and most feared stage in all of history. In Roman society, the gladiator occupied a contradictory, ambiguous, almost schizophrenic position. He was at once a slave and a star, an outcast and an idol, condemned and desired. He lived on the margins of the political elite, but at the very center of the people's fantasies. He had no voice, no rights, yet his image circulated through markets, adorned the walls of homes, haunted the dreams of women, and even the beds of Roman matrons. He was living flesh that Rome worshipped and consumed, a body sculpted for combat and designed for public fascination. The gladiator, smeared with blood and honor, was the rawest reflection of what Rome truly valued: strength, obedience, and spectacle. Though deemed infamous, belonging to one of the lowest social classes, alongside prostitutes, executioners, and actors, gladiators were surrounded by a magnetic aura. They embodied absolute virility, brutality elevated to aesthetic. They were desired by those who feared them, and feared by those who desired them. Suetonius, in his biographies of the emperors, tells of empresses and elite women who became involved with gladiators, scandalizing the nobility. The most famous case is that of Messalina, wife of Claudius, who reportedly fell in love with a gladiator and became entangled in a string of public betrayals, a symbol of power inverted and of the gladiator's erotic allure. The names of champions passed from mouth to mouth like those of mythic heroes. On the walls of Pompeii, graffiti immortalized passionate declarations: Saladus the Thracian is the girl's sigh, or Crescens the Retiarius makes the women faint. They were like posters of modern celebrities. Some gladiators were depicted in frescoes, coins, even small votive statues. They became subjects of tavern gossip and forum debates. Children imitated their movements. Men bet on their victories, and women, many married to patricians, sent letters and secret gifts. The desire for these men did not arise in spite of the violence, but because of it. And that public sensuality was not limited to women. Some gladiators were also objects of desire for men, in a Roman society that normalized homoerotic relationships, especially when there was a disparity in social status. The gladiator, once desired, did not gain dignity, but gained symbolic power. Even as an object, he exercised dominion over the imagination of others. It was a brief subversion of order, the most despised man becoming the most remembered. the most dreamed of, the most feared. But this idolization did not erase the suffering. A gladiator's life was marked by harsh discipline, loneliness, punishment, and constant risk of death. His glories were fleeting, his body scarred, his eyes aged with suspicion. Many were rented out to fight in other cities, carried like merchandise to entertain distant provinces. Some were forced into sexual relations with elite women. Others were poisoned by jealous husbands, and all of them, without exception, knew that the people's love was fleeting. It lasted only as long as their strength. A single defeat, an untreated wound, a hesitation in combat, and it all vanished. Still, some managed to thrive. Those who, through talent and luck, won dozens of battles. Those who earned the bais, rudis, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom. Some became instructors in the ludi. Others served as bodyguards to the wealthy. There were even rare cases of gladiators who amassed enough wealth to buy homes, land, and, ironically, slaves of their own. But few reached that fate. For most, fame lasted the length of a single fight, and death the length of a silence. Even after death, some gladiators were remembered. Their tombs were often honored, their names sung in verse. Some became almost popular martyrs. Roman culture, though cruel, preserved the myths it helped create, and the gladiators, the tragic figure par excellence, embodied like no other the drama of ancient Rome. Greatness built upon pain, beauty forged in suffering, glory bought with flesh and blood. When we imagine the roar of Roman arenas, the clash of swords, and the acrid scent of blood mingled with dust, we almost always picture men. Men fighting for their lives, challenging beasts and emperors. But behind the veil of official history, among archaeological fragments and whispers in ancient sources, a truth emerges that Rome tried to erase. Female gladiators existed. Women who, defying every norm of their time, fought in the arena, bled under the gaze of the crowd, and carved with their own bodies a space of presence in a world that wanted them invisible. The gladiatrices, as they were called, appear only rarely in the records, but they do appear. The most famous mention comes from the inscriptions at Halicarnassus, referring to the combat of two women, Achillea and Amazon, who fought with manly courage before a public audience. The use of mythological names was no accident. These women were treated as curiosities, symbols of role inversion, as if embodying the fusion of the feminine and the martial, the exotic and the brutal. Not coincidentally, the Roman historian Ficus Suetonius Cushion recounts how Emperor Siwantesides Domitian promoted nighttime fights between women and dwarves to entertain and shock the crowd. The gladiatrix was often both spectacle and provocation. Their training followed models similar to those of men. Regulated diets, adapted weapons, specific techniques. They fought against other women or small animals. Sometimes the combat was more sensualized than combative, aiming to excite the audience, rather than simply earn admiration through strength. Yet this eroticization should not be mistaken for a lack of courage. The few gladiatrices who gained fame did so through sweat and bravery, facing not only the physical danger of the arena, but also the scorn of a society that recognized them neither as worthy women nor as warriors. The symbolism behind female presence in the arena was profound. For the empire, allowing women to fight was a demonstration of total control over the social body, even over what tradition demanded be protected. Women who became gladiators, whether slaves, criminals, or in rare cases, free citizens, represented a rupture with the Roman feminine ideal, submissive, domestic, silent. By wielding a sword, a woman ceased to be only a woman. She became a transgressor, a spectacle, a threat. For this very reason, the practice was banned in the 3rd century AD by Emperor Septimius Severus, who considered female combat an affront to Roman order and morality. The attire of the gladiatrices was also part of the spectacle. They often fought wearing minimal clothing, a way to objectify them but also to increase their risk. They did not wear heavy helmets like the men, and their bodily protection was reduced. This heightened both the danger and the audience's excitement. They were sold as rare attractions and advertised with great fanfare. Many surviving posters of combats announced the gladiatrices as wonders of the world, as if seeing a woman wielding a trident was more extraordinary than seeing a man defeat a lion. Still, There is evidence that some were admired. Their names have been preserved not only on posters, but also in graffiti and even tombstones. There are female tombs with inscriptions that show pride in a gladiatorial career. This reveals that even marginalized, these women found in the arena a space for identity affirmation, even at the cost of their physical integrity. In a world that denied them almost everything, the arena was, paradoxically, the only place where they could be feared. With time and with the rise of Christian morality, the memory of the gladiatrices faded. They became legend, rumor, footnote, but their bodies endure, in writings, in sculptures, in painted murals. Figures who defied the logic of their era and declared with weapons in hand that silence was not their fate. And today, as we gaze upon the vast, silent remains of the Roman arena, we may still imagine, among the echoes of the past, the steady steps of a woman walking alone into the center of the world and proving with every blow that even in the heart of the most masculine empire in history, there was room for the roar of a gladiatrix. At the heart of the arena, amid the crowd's screams and the gleam of blades, there was another sound, deeper, more ancient, that did not come from the human throat. The roar of beasts, lions, tigers, elephants, bears, rhinoceroses, leopards, boars, hyenas, an entire zoology ripped from forests, deserts, savannas, and distant jungles, brought to Rome not as scientific curiosity, but as instruments of spectacle, domination, and horror. The venationes, or hunts, were far more than simple battles between man and animal. They were public enactments of Rome's superiority over all that was wild, foreign, or unfamiliar. The beasts were captured during military campaigns or by specialized hunters paid by the state. They were carried on long journeys by land and sea, locked in tight cages, transported for weeks or months to the heart of the empire. Some died before arrival. Others arrived starving, beaten, maddened. But those who survived entered the arena. And there, beneath the Roman sun and the gaze of 50,000 eyes, they were unleashed as pieces on a board of ritualized violence. The Duvenatione usually took place in the early morning. It was the warm-up for the day's spectacle. The bestiaries gladiators trained to face beasts entered armed with spears, nets, tridents, or simple shields. Some were volunteers, many were condemned. A few demonstrated astonishing skill, dodging lions with swift movements, bringing down tigers with precise strikes. Others were not so lucky, or so skilled, and were torn apart to the applause of the crowd. The arena became an artificial jungle, with staged landscapes simulating forests, mountains, or deserts. Rome didn't just want to witness death. It wanted to stage the world Sanchat within its arena and conquer it in miniature. But not all combats were fair, or even real. In many cases, the crowned beasts were drugged, wounded or starved and for days beforehand to ensure they would attack ferociously. Sometimes they were painted or adorned, transformed into exotic parodies to amuse the audience. Elephants wore armor, ostriches wore crowns, monkeys rode dogs like miniature soldiers. Cruelty became spectacle, and spectacle became a reflection of the empire's thirst not only to dominate peoples, but to dominate nature itself. Animals were also used as instruments of execution. The condemned, Christians, criminals, slaves, were thrown into the arena bound, naked, and unarmed before starving lions. This was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, one of the most brutal punishments in Roman law. The people watched in ecstasy. It was not merely a death, it was a ritual, an offering to the power of Rome. The human body, torn by fangs, became the ultimate symbol of what awaited those who defied imperial order. The number of animals killed was colossal. It is estimated that, during the inauguration of the Colosseum, under Emperor Titus, around 5,000 beasts were slaughtered in a single event. In another festival organized by the Trajan to celebrate his victory over the Dacians, over than 11,000 animals were killed. Extinct lions, rare tigers, African leopards, even crocodiles and hippos, all offered as sacrifices to satisfy the Roman crowd. The biodiversity of 3 continents paraded before Rome's eyes, only to be destroyed amid shouts, applause, and dust. And yet, amidst such violence there was beauty. Paradoxical and unsettling, yes, but beauty. The animals were admired, feared, revered. Some spectacles featured tamers who trained leopards to leap through hoops, bears to dance, or elephants to kneel before the emperor. They were moments of collective fascination, a brief suspension of brutality before it all resumed. Because in Rome, even beauty always stood on the edge of destruction. As the centuries passed, and especially with the rise of Christian values, perceptions of animal use in the arena began to shift. Criticism grew. Philosophers and poets denounced the bloodshed as needless, cruel, unworthy, but the damage was done. The beasts of the Colosseum were not merely animals. They were the symbols of the known world, devoured, tamed, and destroyed by Rome before the eyes of its own people. And their roars even today still echo among the ruins. Rome was not merely an empire of swords and roads. It was an empire of symbols. And no symbol was more powerful, more lasting, or more effective than that of the arena. Behind every enthusiastic cheer, every raised or turned thumb, there was something greater than a thirst for violence. There was a project of emotional and political domination. Public spectacles, especially gladiator combats, were the axis of a social engineering that kept the people fascinated and distracted, fed and controlled. The Colosseum was not just a monument of stone, it was a political machine. And the gladiators, the gears that turned the heart of the plebs. The famous expression, panem et circenses, coined by the poet Juvenal, was not merely satire, it was a sharp observation. The Roman people, he said, had surrendered their political voice in exchange for free bread and grand spectacles, and the emperors knew it. Instead of speeches, they offered blood. Instead of reforms, battles. Instead of justice, emotion. It was a powerful and relatively cheap currency. Feeding the masses with grain and adrenaline kept the city at peace. Hunger was the spark of revolts, boredom, the spark of criticism. But with full stomachs and hypnotized eyes, Rome slept and power reigned. From Julius Caesar to Trajan, great leaders used the games as a tool of self-promotion. Julius Caesar offered 200 gladiator fights in a single festival, aiming to win the hearts of the people and secure his political power. Titus, in inaugurating the Colosseum, celebrated not only an architectural feat, but the Flavian dynasty's triumph over Nero's tyrannical memory. Domitian ordered the construction of the Poi Ludus Magnus, the largest gladiator school, to ensure the excellence of the games. Trajan, after defeating the Dacians, staged games that lasted over 100 days, with thousands of men and beasts slaughtered. Each combat was a silent decree. Rome is invincible, and I am Rome. They were called munera, gifts. The Latin word meant offering, tribute. The politician who organized games gave this gift to the people, and in return received applause, loyalty, and prestige. It was a way to purchase symbolic capital. The games were not neutral. They were used to celebrate military victories, to calm social tensions, to mark the rise of a new emperor, or to cover up periods of crisis. If there was hunger in the poor districts, more games. If there was scandal in the Senate, more combat. The arena became the antidote to chaos, a collective anesthetic served with fresh blood and calculated emotions. The cost of the spectacles was colossal, but worthwhile. The emperors not only won over the people, but reinforced the idea that Rome was the center of the world, that no other empire was as rich, as vast, or as feared. The arena was a living metaphor for imperial order. At its center, death. Around it, the public, divided by class, by clothing, by status, each in their place. Senators in front, women at the top, the poor in the corners. All, however, united by a shared emotion, the fascination with controlled destruction. The spectacles also functioned as a moral mirrors. By watching the gladiators, the people were taught Roman virtues: courage, discipline, obedience, honor. Those who fought bravely to the end, even in death, were applauded. Those who hesitated or fled were booed. The arena did more than entertain, it educated. It was a visual catechism of what it meant to be a Roman citizen, to be ready for war, for sacrifice, for glory. But there was something even deeper. The spectacles were a form of collective purification. The city, filled with inequality, ethnic tensions, and internal disputes, found in the arena a place where everything was resolved in combat. One man fell, and the people felt that their own conflicts had been washed away in that blood. It was a ritual theater of artificial unity, where all could shout together, cheer together, forget together. The politics of spectacle was, above all, the art of keeping the empire cohesive through the illusion of participation. And so the Colosseum, more than a building, became an eternal symbol of power masked as generosity, of control disguised as celebration, of a civilization that understood, far too early, that an enchanted people does not rebel. And as long as the gladiators kept fighting, Rome would continue to reign, within and beyond the hearts of its citizens. For centuries, the arena was the beating heart of Rome. Every clash of swords, every roar of beasts, every raised or turned thumb echoed through the corridors of the city like pagan prayers sung in unison. But even the strongest empires are not only eroded by war and crisis, they are undone by ideas. And Rome, once the undisputed master of staged death, began to hear voices no longer calling for blood, but for compassion. The end of gladiatorial games did not come all at once, nor from a single cause, but as a peace slow and symbolic erosion, where the steel of the gladiators was replaced by the whisper of martyrs, and the arena, once exalting the body, began to bow before the soul. At the center of this transformation stood Christianity, a faith that blossomed in the empire's shadows. For Christians, the body was not an instrument of spectacle, it was a temple of the spirit. Death was not public glory, but sacred sacrifice. The virtues exalted in the arena, strength, vengeance, domination, clashed with Christian values of forgiveness, humility, and mercy. And little by little, these ideas spread, not only among slaves and the poor, but among soldiers, senators, and emperors. The arenas began to change meaning. Where once the people applauded the execution of criminals, they now witnessed the martyrdom of Christians. Men and women who, instead of begging for mercy, accepted death with serenity, singing hymns, refusing to renounce their faith. The Colosseum, which once celebrated Rome's dominion over the body, now bore witness to something Rome could not understand, the victory of spirit over pain. And for many spectators, that was deeply unsettling. Watching a man face lions with a sword was inspiring, but watching someone face them with songs was revolutionary. The impact of these martyrdoms was profound. The people began to divide. Some still cried out for blood, others wept. The words of philosophers echoed once more. Seneca, even before Christianity's rise, had criticized the empty cruelty of the games. Cicero, in his writings, spoke of the inhumanity of public executions, but now the Christians turned that critique into practice, refusing to attend the games, condemning the barbarity, calling for a new kind of civilization. Over time, even the emperors began to convert. Constantine, after his conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century, did not immediately abolish the games, but gave clear signs that they no longer fit the emerging era. Decrees began to limit certain practices, especially the most brutal, like damnatio ad bestias. The cost of the spectacles, increasingly high, could no longer be justified in a divided, fragile empire, threatened by barbarian invasions and internal crises. The final end came in waves. In 404 Narrated, Honorius officially banned gladiator combat after an event that would mark history. A monk named Telemachus, seeing two gladiators about to fight, descended into the arena and tried to separate them in the name of God. He was stoned to death by the crowd, but his death echoed louder than any bloody victory. The emperor, shocked, decreed the end of the games, and so silence fell over the arena. The Colosseum, once a temple of blood, became a ruin, a symbol, a relic. The ludi were emptied, the lanistae vanished, the graffiti faded from the walls, and the gladiators, once stars and martyrs, became shadows of memory. The world was changing. Ritual violence gave way to prayer. The sword yielded to the cross, and the empire, without realizing it, let go of a part of its soul, perhaps its wildest, perhaps its most honest. Yet even in decline, the arena was never forgotten. Its echoes still live in the words we use, in the films we watch, in the metaphors we choose. For the spectacle of death, transformed into art, left marks that millennia cannot erase. And Rome, even Christianized, even converted, never ceased to be the Rome of the gladiators, because in the end the arena was more than stone, blood, and sand. It was the mirror of an empire's soul. When the shouting ceased and the dust settled, When helmets were left behind on blood-stained sand and swords rusted in the silence of ruins, many believed the gladiators had vanished, that their story had died with them, forgotten among cracked columns and faded inscriptions. But Rome, even in ruins, never forgets its myths, and the gladiator, that tragic, heroic and brutal figure, did not die with the end of the arenas. He transcended, became a symbol, an archetype, an eternal whisper in the human imagination. Centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, even as the stones of the Colosseum were repurposed to build churches and fortresses, the stories of gladiators still circulated through medieval manuscripts, chronicles, and poems. They were remembered as cursed warriors, as sinners and martyrs, as echoes of a pagan, proud, and cruel Rome. But it was with the Renaissance and the rediscovery of classical values that gladiators once again took center stage. Painters depicted them in noble poses, sculptors shaped their bodies as ideals of strength, and playwrights brought them back to the stage, now as tragic heroes, victims of an insatiable society. In the 19th century, gladiators became the obsession of archaeologists, novelists, and historians. The excavation of Pompeii revealed graffiti, armor, personal belongings, and even the bones of fighters buried with honor. A new fascination was born. No longer were they seen merely as instruments of death, but as men with stories, desires, and fears, human beings, protagonists of a past as distant as it is familiar. Then came the 20th century, and with it, cinema. And it was on the dark screen of theaters that gladiators were reborn with new force. Films like Ben-Hur, 1959, to Spartacus, 1960, and decades later the powerful Gladiator, 2000, reintroduced to the modern world the figure of the arena fighter, the slave who rises against the empire, the wounded man who defies gods and emperors, the warrior who, though condemned, chooses to fight. Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, was not just a character. He became a global symbol of resistance, honor, tragedy, and redemption. The film's lines still echo like contemporary psalms. What we do in life echoes in eternity. The arena, now digital, remains alive. Video games, comics, series, and social media have created new versions, new idols, new arenas, but the heart remains the same. The modern gladiator carries the same weight as his ancestors, the desire to be seen, to win, to survive. And thus, between pixels and memories, between real sand and virtual stage, the gladiator continues to march through the centuries, a metaphor for the human condition itself. Why does this figure never fade? Perhaps because in some way we all feel like we are in an arena, fighting for recognition, confronting greater forces, choosing, even without a gladius, to face our own lions. The gladiator is the eternal symbol of humanity in adversity, of the exposed body, of pain turned to strength, of death turned to legend. Today, when visiting the Colosseum under the Roman sky, amid the whispers of the wind and the hurried steps of tourists, it is still possible, if one listens closely, to hear an ancient echo. The echo of forgotten names, of vanished battles, of bloodied hands lifted to the heavens. And in those echoes the gladiators still live, not as killers, not as victims, but as eternal voices of a Rome that, even fallen, never went silent. The Colosseum rests today like a sleeping giant. Its broken arches, its empty corridors, its stones worn by time, all seem like ruins. But don't be deceived. Inside, time never stopped, because the true Colosseum is not made of marble or concrete. It is made of memory, of cries that never ceased, of footsteps that still echo, of eyes that never looked away from death. Every crack in its walls is a scar of history. Every block of stone carries the weight of 1,000 destinies. The arena, now covered in moss and silence, was once a stage for dreams, for battles, for glories and defeats that the world has never forgotten. And even though the swords have fallen silent, even though the crowds have vanished, something remains. An invisible presence, a whisper between the columns. The gladiator is still there. He breathes through the stories we tell, revives in the images we project, resurfaces in the eyes of those who, when facing their own pain, find the courage to keep fighting. Because all of us at some point have been thrown into the arena of life, naked, wounded, alone, before forces we do not control, before audiences we did not choose, Before judgments we cannot understand, and still, we fight. The gladiators of Rome were not just armed men. They were mirrors of the human soul. Fractured, hungry, hopeful, they represented the courage to exist even when the world seemed lost. They embodied the body as altar, sweat as prayer, struggle as purpose. And that is why they endure even now, among screens and pages, among statues and shadows, among the living who remember and the dead who follow. Let this story not be only a recollection, but a reflection, that in learning of life and death in the Roman arenas, we may better understand the nature of our own battles. Because the arena changes, the costumes change, the weapons change, but the spirit that once faced death with eyes wide open, that spirit never disappeared. May the memory of the gladiators remind us that greatness does not lie in always winning, but in standing tall, even when all seems lost. Sleep with history, wake with wisdom.